background. So now we'll come on to the New Testament. And there are basically two main ways in which evangelical Christians have interpreted what the Bible teaches about divorce and remarriage. And there's what's sometimes known as the minority view, which was the view held by what they know as the early fathers. That doesn't mean the elders of the early Christian fellowship or the old folks or anything like that. It just simply means notable Christians who lived right on the edge of the first century into the second century and actually into the third one as well. So it's the people who came after the apostles. And some people say, and in fact these folks say, Wynnum and Heth said originally, that the view of those early fathers really ought to be given very great weight, because they were closest, they said, to the mindset of the apostles. They were closest to the way that these people have understood. And I did say, actually, when we were together last week, that having written this and having had it reprinted, Wynnum and Heth, this book, which takes that particular view, which is the minority view. And the minority view says divorce is permitted, but remarriage is never permitted. That's the minority view, which was held by the early fathers. That divorce is permitted, but that remarriage is never permitted. But that one of the authors of that, some time ago, wrote this paper called Jesus on Divorce, How My Mind Has Changed, and that's Heth. And I'm not saying this to ridicule this man. This is a man of, I think, unusual integrity in the academic world. This man has had a very public stance on what he felt, and he's reconsidered things, he's looked at different issues, and he's come to a different conclusion, and has actually had the nerve to say, I think I got it wrong, which I think is very rare in these particular circles. And then there's something that's called the majority, the more usual Protestant view, which I think was kind of held by Luther and most other Protestants who have had comment to make this, which is that there could be other reasons for divorce, particularly desertion, and that once divorce had taken place, that there could be remarriage. So those are the two main views, and there are some kind of slight variance in some of the views, but those are the two main things. Both accepted divorce, but some said you can be divorced. It's not God's best, but you can be divorced, but there's to be no remarriage. And others said, well, you can be divorced, and they would also say that's not God's best, but they would say, but divorce does bring the first marriage to an end, and consequently that person is then free to remarry. Okay, so what we need to do is sort of try and think about how we're going to interpret the things that Jesus said, and how we're going to try and interpret the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So we'll have a look at what Jesus has to say first of all in Matthew chapter 19. There are at least five times in the Gospels where divorce is mentioned or referred to. One is actually in what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. But the other three records are actually records of one particular event. And I think it's important that we look at this to see how it starts off in Matthew chapter 19. Maybe I ought to tell you so that I don't leave you guessing. My view, and I'm not sort of trying to convince you that it's right, I'm just sort of trying to explain why I hold it. My view is that divorce is permissible, that it is not God's best, that divorce is permissible for sexual immorality, for desertion, and for any major breakdown of those three elements that were part of the implied marriage contract. In other words, if the man is not caring for his wife and has abandoned his care for his wife, in other words, if he deserts but still stays at home, I think that is still a legitimate grounds for divorce. That's my own personal opinion. And that once that divorce has taken place, then the person who has the divorce is then free to remarry. That's my position. Wasn't. My position was the opposite extreme to that. I think I said this the last time we were together, that I held this position for a long time, that my position was that the first sexual union between a man and a woman created an indissoluble bond, a bond that could only be broken by death, and that consequently there was no divorce. Well, there was no point in divorce because there was no possibility of remarriage. That was my opinion for a long time. And I'll say this, because I said it last time, but I will say it again for any who weren't here. It's relatively easy to come to decisions about these things when you're in your study. It's people that keep getting in the way. It's when you're actually handling people that you really need to be sure that what you're saying is not just some thing that you have concluded in your own mind, but that really is the way it ought to be. And what I said last week is that there are some things that I believe, but I'm not sure I'd be willing to die for them. There are some things that I believe that I might not have to die for, but somebody else would have to die for, or that someone's whole life actually would go into onto the pause mode because of some belief I had. And I mentioned a young woman that I met. This is a long time. This is over 20 years ago now. She was in her early 20s. She had become a Christian. God had done an amazing thing in her life, and she was absolutely transformed. The consequence was that her husband, of only a year, said he didn't want to be with her any longer. He said, "You're not the woman I married. You won't get drunk. You won't go to the pubs. You won't go dancing. You won't do the things that we used to do. I'm leaving." And now the question is, and he divorced her. And the question now is, what do you say to this young woman? And this is always the key question, that the pastoral aspect of things. You have to ask this question. What are you going to say to this one young woman? She's 22. She has been married for 12 months. Her woman's instincts and appetites are wide awake. Are you to say to this young woman now that for the next 60 or 70 years there is no possibility of you ever having a husband? Now, I think you have to be sure before you say that. That's the point I'm making. Because this isn't a question of my mental comfort. It's a question of this woman's whole life and the implications. Now, if it's right that she shouldn't get married, I'm not afraid to say it. I'm not afraid to say it. But I have to be sure. I have to be absolutely sure. And if you're not sure, then you come back to this question again and again and again and again, as I have. Okay, so what's the context of what the Lord Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19? Let's look at that. Matthew chapter 19, and the previous chapter, interestingly enough, is mostly to do with forgiveness. And then often you get these kind of contrasts in the scripture, and whether this was in Matthew's mind when he wrote this record down, I don't know. To me, the previous chapter is very significant as you come into this one. Chapter 19, now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for..." Now, I'm reading the New King James Version here, and it says, "for just any reason." Now, the word just, if you've got a New King James, you'll see that it's probably in italics, which means it's not actually in the Greek text. But the translators have put it into the translation because they think it helps you to understand. And I think in this instance they have. So I'll read that verse again. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" This context is all about what they call any matter divorces. In other words, this is a continuation of the Shammai-Hillel debate. And now they want to drag Jesus into it. They want to know where he stands on this. Maybe they've seen what they think in him is a certain kind of tolerant attitude to certain aspects of the law, and they think he may be a bit woolly on certain things. So is he on the side of Shammai, or is he which is the old one, or is he on with Hillel, who is the more kind of liberal thing? But this is the question, and it's important to know that this is the question. This is not just a question about divorce. This is a question about divorce for any matter. In other words, this is a question about divorce for any reason, or in effect for no reason at all. And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason shall a man leave his wife, his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? He said, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And you remember I said, I see significance in the fact that this follows the chapter preceding it, which is mostly to do with forgiveness. Now, what the Jewish rabbis said and what the Jewish law said was that if your wife had been unfaithful to you, you had to give her a certificate of divorce. You had to divorce her. There was no alternative for you. And they said, well, Moses commanded that, and Jesus said Moses didn't command that. Moses permitted that. And he permitted that because of the hardness of your hearts. So we begin to see that maybe he has some other thoughts in mind. And then it goes on, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. And his disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it's better not to marry. You can see how they expected things to be, with a much more lenient, easy getting rid of your wife if you wanted to. And he said to them, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. Verse 12, for there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Now this is an interesting thing, and we'll see if we can look at this. But what I want to say first of all is, let's be sure that we understand the context. The context is one of hostile questionings with hostile attitudes from the Pharisees, who want to get Jesus to decide one way or the other. And the question they're asking really is, how valid is the any matter divorce? Is it valid? That's the real question they're asking. So remember, that's the question that we're answering as we go through this. So then you've got this thing, and you've got this part that speaks about it apparently justifies divorce for immorality. Just a minute. So apparently it looks as though he's saying yes, they can be divorced. But we've said previously that a valid divorce always included the right to remarry. So what he's really saying here is that, what I'm saying is that I think we need to understand his answer in the light of what we've seen previous. And that is that he's talking about it's wrong for, if there's been an invalid divorce, if that person goes ahead and marries, as far as he is concerned, because the divorce is invalid, the first marriage still stands. And consequently, the person who takes on a second marriage is actually now in a continual case of adultery or sexual immorality, because they're still actually joined to the first one. So this is my understanding of it. So did Jesus agree with the more conservative one, Shammai? Well, Shammai mandated, he insisted on divorce, and Jesus permitted it. There are some differences in these three records, and we mentioned this the last time we were together. And I think, again, they're important differences. It's interesting, for example, in Mark's record of this, that Mark capturing what was said, not just like a tape recorder getting the exact words, but capturing the nuances of what was said and the meaning of what's said, actually adds another part to it. I believe inspired by the Holy Spirit. It isn't that he is a poor reporter. He knows exactly what is said, but here we have the miracle of inspiration inspiring Mark. And Mark actually adds the fact that a woman can divorce her husband, which was certainly very, very rare in Jewish circles. It was very rare actually in the wider world. Some Roman women did it from time to time, and wealthy people occasionally did it. But it was very, very rare. But it was a fact of life kind of in the Gentile world. And Mark's gospel is very much kind of a gospel. It's on the move, it's quick, it's abrupt, it gets to points, and it would have made a lot of sense to include that part in there. So Mark has the possibility of divorce, but both the wife divorcing the husband, but both Mark and Luke suggest that there's absolutely no possibility of divorce. But Matthew's gospel says, except for sexual immorality. And that little phrase, except for sexual immorality, has become known as the exception clause. So they say it is the only reason. But what I'm saying is that, no, it isn't the only reason, because that isn't the question. The question is there a valid reason for divorce? The question was, is any reason a valid reason for divorce? And Jesus comes back to what was basically the Shemite position and says only for sexual immorality. Okay. So was Christ cancelling out those kind of divorce possibilities that we saw from Exodus 21? You remember it was food and clothing and sexual rights within the marriage. Well, no, that wasn't part of the discussion. That wasn't what they were talking about. And this is one of the dilemmas we have actually with what Jesus said and with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. That we come to the scriptures and it's like coming into a conversation and you hear someone answering a question that's just been asked. And you don't exactly know what the question was, and you don't know what the conversation was about. It's like you're coming into a room and you find two people and you join the conversation at the point where I am saying, well, it might fit better in that corner because it is green. And you say, now, what's this about? Where does this fit in? And you need to be able to sort of try and work back a little bit to find out what question we were talking about to understand the answer. Now, with the Pharisees here, you can see exactly what the question was. They were talking about any matter divorces. And Jesus' answer is no to any matter divorces. No. The only legitimate reason is fornication. I'm sure it would have included desertion. And I'm actually sure it would include these other three things as well. He was rejecting the Hillel form of divorce. He wasn't rejecting the ancient kind of patterns of what the Jews had believed. Okay, I want to go on to Paul and the Corinthian context. I may not have answered all your questions there, but you'll have an opportunity to ask some in a moment. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which is how we got here, because we are supposed to be looking at church life revisited in Corinthians, we've got this chapter, and what I've said about Corinthians several times, and I want to say it again, is that if you're trying to find out what is the real issue, what's the real problem with the church at Corinth, what is it that's gone so tragically wrong in the church of Corinth, I think the answer is, and I think it comes from the very first page, every one of you says I. Every single one of them was demanding their rights. They were insisting on their rights. And again through 1 Corinthians, you'll find that Paul's answers can really be understood in the light of answering that particular problem. Their problem is they are demanding their own rights. They're insisting upon their own rights. In fact, even as a church, they're insisting upon their own rights to their own independence. And you'll find several times that Paul has to remind the church at Corinth that there are other churches in which the Spirit of God is moving, and there are other patterns in other churches, and that the church at Corinth is not an island on its own. We said this right in our very first time, that Corinth was noted for its independence, and the church was independent, and the individuals were independent, and they delighted in doing their own thing and just pleasing themselves. And Paul's theme through much of 1 Corinthians, in a sense, is almost, yes, there are human rights, there are church rights, and you must be sure that you give them to everybody. Not that you stand up for your own, but that you make sure that you respect everybody else's rights. That's what it's all about. And you've got some little phrases in here that are... Here, my eye just falls on this one in chapter 7 and verse 31. You've got this phrase, and I think this may help us understand some of these things. Verse 31, he's talking about... the time is short, he says, and we should behave the way he's counseling them to behave because the time is short. And then he says this, verse 31. And I'll read from verse 30 to make sense of it. Those who weep as though they did not weep, those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it. That word misuse is literally overusing it. So Paul says, yes, use the world, but don't overuse it. It's all a question of balance, this is. And if you remember from chapter 3, when we were in chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, in verse 21, Paul said this. Verse 21, therefore let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world, or life or death, all things present, all things to come, all are yours. And in the middle of that little list is the world. The world is yours. And Paul actually says, use it, but don't overuse it. Don't rely on it. Don't let it become the pattern of your life. And you'll see that really has to do with rights as well. Yes, we have rights. And we also have this glorious right to lay down our rights if we choose to. We said in the first part of chapter 7, it's a wonderful kind of demonstration. It's a pity, I think, that we don't come to this passage more frequent, because this is a wonderful statement here, not just about mutuality, but about how each partner in the marriage is constantly reminded of the rights of the other partner. In these first 7 verses, it's constantly saying, remember your wife's rights, and remember that she actually, your body, actually that's her right. And then he says to the wife, yeah, well actually, your body, well that's actually his right. And it's all the time when he speaks to someone, he actually says, somebody else has a right. Somebody else has a right. He never says, you have a right. This is one of the things you discover if you get involved in kind of pastoral care from time to time. Then if you're counselling and you're perhaps trying to help married people, that you discover that the wife knows perfectly how the husband ought to behave. And the husband knows perfectly how the wife ought to behave. And my pattern for a long, long time has been very, very simply, when I'm talking to the wife, to ignore all the husband's responsibilities and just concentrate on the wife's responsibilities. And when I'm talking to the husband, to ignore the wife's responsibilities and to ignore all the buts and all the things that start but she, to ignore all those and concentrate on this is your responsibility. So there are rights and responsibility. Yours is the responsibility, the other person has the rights. This is kind of a unique pattern of Christian experience, and it's only possible for people who, like the Corinthians originally, had a real encounter with the Spirit. The other thing in remembering as we come to 1 Corinthians is that Paul gives some counsel in chapter 7, and he says he's saying these things because, where's this little phrase? He says, about when it talks about this present distress. Thank you. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it's good for a man to remain as he is. And you see kind of pictures of it as the time is short. It comes through several times in 1 Corinthians 7. And the other interesting thing is, of course, that if you think very briefly, we won't go into it now, but if you think of 2 Corinthians, do you remember how 2 Corinthians begins? It all begins with Paul reassuring people who are going through distressing times that God will give them grace in their distressing times, and that their grace actually will be a source of comfort for others, that you will be able to comfort with the comfort wherewith God has comforted you. So you can see that as you move on into 2 Corinthians, you've got more deeply into this area of distress. Persecution was hotting up at this time, and some of the things that Paul is saying here are very much in that context. It's the context that things are hard, they are harsh, they're getting worse. And sometimes he says, in the light of the present circumstances, my personal judgment would be this, but I'm not making a noose for you. It actually uses that word, it's like a lasso. I'm not making something to wrap you into this. I'm not insisting on you doing this. If you want to know, this is what I am advising. Okay, so that's part of the things. But we've got some other things that we don't know about. In chapter 7 and verse 1, it begins like this. Paul says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me." And then he says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. So obviously the Corinthian church had written to Paul a series of questions, and there's about half a dozen of them now in the rest of 1 Corinthians, which begin with the little phrase concerning. And Paul is obviously going down his list and he's answering these questions. Our problem in trying to interpret it is that we don't have the list. So we're actually sort of trying to work out what the questions were from the answers. But I think some of the answers may be along these kind of lines as you come to 1 Corinthians 7. One of the questions may have been, would it be better for us to be celibate, that's to say single at this time? Would it be better to be celibate within marriage? One of the things that Paul has to face in 1 Corinthians is kind of a double temptation for the church there. One is to the promiscuity, which is the pattern of life in Corinth generally. But the other opposite danger is asceticism. Now, asceticism is when people trim everything back to the bone and they think that suffering pleases God. That's the opposite kind of end to hedonism or just living for pleasure. And you get clues of this in 1 Corinthians, that both of these things were happening. It's always the case, of course, that you always get people who react and they go in the opposite direction. And sometimes the reaction causes more trouble than the original problem. You know, it's like the medicine, you know, I've got over the illness, I'm hoping to recover soon from the medicine kind of thing. It's that kind of pattern. So, what Paul is dealing with in 1 Corinthians 7 really is the impact of the gospel on personal relationships. What does the gospel have to say now about me? Should I be married? And Paul says it's because of the temptations of things like fornication. It's better for a man to have his own wife, and it's better for a woman to have her own man. So no, celibacy, no, that is not necessary. And he actually goes on to say, and it's important that you enjoy your marriage relationship, that you are mindful of the needs of one another. In other words, well, should we be celibate within our marriage? And the answer is no, because your partner has needs and rights. And that's it. I actually know somebody who at one point began a kind of a celibate relationship within his marriage, thinking that would please God and free him and enable him to serve God more effectively. The consequences of that were absolutely tragic. I won't go into that, but the answer is no. No, you're not to be celibate within marriage unless you're praying and you're fasting, and that would be a distraction. Well, by mutual consent, then wait for a while. But when the period of prayer and fasting is over, come back together again. But he's very, very practical and very specific in what he says. Okay, so that's one question. Should we be celibate? Should we be celibate within the marriage? How about this question? Well, should we get rid of our Christian partners, our non-Christian partners? Because surely that would enable us to serve God better, wouldn't it? Because we shouldn't be unequally yoked together. We know that two can't walk together unless they be agreed. Wouldn't it be better for our Christian experience and for our service of God if we actually got rid of our non-Christian wives? And there's an answer which fit, if that was one of the questions, there's an answer here which would fit that one. And finally, and these are just me thinking about the questions are, what about our young people? Should we encourage our young people to stay single? If I'm a father and I've got a daughter, maybe she's already engaged, should I encourage her in the light of the present distress? Should I tell her, should I withdraw my permission for her to get married? Should I cancel the marriage? And the answer again is no. So you've got this series of questions, and I think if you have in mind these kind of questions, you can create a sort of a scenario which makes sense of these answers. Maybe you will have another scenario and that will make sense of the answers as well. So where are we going with this? Remember then, and I think this is key again in understanding what Paul is doing here, that what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 7 is not trying to create, he's not actually writing a book on divorce and remarriage. That's not the question. The question is, in these present circumstances, and in these unique circumstances, perhaps of this one having a non-Christian husband, this one having a non-Christian wife, what do we do in these unique circumstances? So he's not cancelling out what Jesus said. He's not cancelling out what's been said in the Old Testament. He's simply applying contextual applications of those truths to this situation. And he's looking at the specific questions asked and he's giving his answers here. I'm going to pause now for the tape.